everyone. Welcome to our second webinar of this winter quarter. This webinar is sponsored by the Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA, which is part of the Latin American Institute. I would like to, before we start, to read UCLA land acknowledgement. The Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tonga people. Welcome, everyone, and we're in for a real treat. We have Professor Pablo Piccato as our guest today, and he's going to talk about his book, A Brief History of Violence in Mexico. Professor Piccato is the history department at Columbia University, and he will share with us a little bit more of his work, but he specializes in Mexican history. And in order to carry out this conversation, we have the great fortune to have Fernando Perez Montesinos, associate professor here at history at UCLA, who will conduct a conversation with Pablo. So Fernando, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Gaspar. Let me start by saying that it is a pleasure to have this conversation with Pablo. Pablo is one of the foremost historians of Mexico in the United States, and I believe also more generally globally. So this is truly an honor. And then we are here to discuss his latest publication, A Brief History of Violence. And I would start by saying that this is a very timely publication. And that it is very rare that books published first in Spanish get translated into English for the wider audience of the United States. So that first observation really speaks of the importance and the transcendence of this particular publication. It's a book that deals with a difficult subject. It's a difficult subject, but I think that Pablo in general tried to approach the topic in a very insightful and careful way. And we are here to discuss more generally what this book is about, how he put it together, what is the audience, the intended audience, and what were the expectations in the beginning when writing this book. So let me start by actually asking Pablo that very question. How did the project start in the first place?
Okay, first of all, thank you so much, Fernando, Gaspar. Also, thank you for organizing this, and Ariadne. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about the book with you, and also to hear the questions that the attendees may have. The origin of the book, you know, I wrote what I thought was going to be my last book on questions of crime and justice, and it was published in 2017. It was a history of infamy. And I was ready to move on into more, pleasant, topics. But then some friends at the Colegio de Mexico, Erika Pani, Pablo Yankelevich, they invited me to write one of the books in their Historias Mínimas series, which is a very, very smart, collection of short books on histories, on historical topics, a wide range of topics that is directed at a broader audience and is distributed much better than regular academic books. The Colegio de Mexico were very creative in putting this in front of, readers. I had to say yes, basically, because even if it was my plan, because I like the idea that this was not like a regular national history of Mexico where you have all the chapters on the different things. but that I could have a freedom to focus on one topic, which more or less know, which is violence. And also because it was an opportunity to reach readers that will never look at my, scholarly books, So I said yes. It took me, some time. Basically, it was a work of synthesis, which is not what I used to, but I thought it was worth it. I don't regret it. And then the University of North Carolina helped me get a grant to have it translated into English. Quentin Pope was the translator. He did, in my opinion, a great job. I'm hoping also that this is a way to engage audiences that monographs sometimes don't reach.
Good, thank you. Like I said in the beginning, this is a very difficult subject, and it's also a very broad subject. So the history of violence in Mexico, it's very appealing, the the title of the book, but at the same time, it poses challenges, right? How do we approach violence? How do we approach violence specifically in Mexico at a time when Mexico is associated with criminal organizations that use violence systematically and systemically. So it's quite a challenge. So my question to you is, well, you said that you were compelled to write this book, but at the same time, I'm sure that you knew that this was going to be very challenging. It was not only a book about summarizing historiographies and literature, but also how to approach this very big subject. So can you tell us a little bit about how you organized this book? How did you manage to sort of make these choices on how to talk about violence in Mexico?
Yes, it was quite a challenge because, first of all, I don't know you, Fernando, but I mean, as a historian, I'm not used to write a synthesis. I mean, I do my research, I go to the archive, the sources, and then I put that together. But in this case, what I had to do was to look at the work of many people, historians, but also anthropologists, sociologists, journalists, fiction writers. I had to look at a very broad spectrum of secondary sources, if you want, primary and secondary sources, right? And try to, make it make sense. That was probably the hardest, the most difficult challenge, right? Because you can just tell the story and it's one thing after another, right? I mean, you can just say what happened. But that wasn't, I didn't want to do that. I mean, I thought that one of the goals that I had from the outset was to show that there is not one Mexican violence, because to me it was very important to attack this stereotype and this essentialization of Mexico as a violent country. I know, writing about violence would seem to foster that, but I thought, if we do it right, maybe I can make the case that there is not a single form of violence. There are multiple forms of violence, and they are connected historically. So I try to, it's a history book. It's not a theoretical book. It's not a methodological book. They're situated in space and in time. So how to talk about those forms of violence in a way that will show their connections, but without assuming a single cause or arguing, like many people have done in Mexico for the 20th century, using psychological or cultural arguments about violence in Mexico. This idea that Mexicans are violent or that Mexicans tolerate violence more than other people. I just wanted to show how that doesn't have any grounding in the history of violence, at least. So it was a challenge, yes. I mean, what I did was to, as you mentioned, to divide it in chapters that were defined by the different kinds of violence. Whereas the argument is there are different violences, they're connected, but they're not the same. We have to understand them in their own terms and in their own time. So I had one, the first chapter is about the revolution, obviously, which is an explosion of violence. Is something that made possible the political and criminal violence that came later, but it's not the only cause of it. Then the agrarian violence that followed the revolution, or it overlaps in many ways, depending how you define the periods, but basically is the violence around or about the land, which is different from the revolutionary violence. And I wanted to show how it was different in the way in which people use violence, but also the ways in which people justified or legitimized the use of violence, right? Then I had a chapter on religious violence, which focused on the Cristero War, the resistance against the post-revolutionary regime, but also the violence that followed the Cristiada, the kind of right-wing Catholic violence that in many cases has, elements of fascism, although there's no fascist movement in Mexico as such, but it is similarly based on these ideas about the other and intolerance and so forth. So that was another chapter. The next chapter was about criminal violence, especially during the mid-20th century, the way in which politics and politicians became, in a way, administrators of violence and crime, right? How they use their expertise to profit from power, no? The following chapter, which I think had to be treated separately, was the guerrilla insurgency or the guerrilla movements in the 60s and 70s, and the way in which they were repressed or attacked by the government. So it's one chapter in which I really am dealing with two phenomena, right? I mean, the revolutionary armed movements, but also the militarized, response to those movements. They're different things, although they had certain things in common, certain aspects in common, but they had to be treated together. And then the following chapter was the chapter where I tried to attack, what you mentioned, this idea that people have about Mexico as a place of drugs and violence. And if you look at the history of drug trafficking, you can see how violence was something that came to it, but was not inherent to it. So I tried to show that as a process. When and where did the violence happen? How? Who committed it? What was the relation between the organized crime and the state, or state agents, if you want? And then the final chapter was not chronological, but it's something that emerged out of the process of writing a book and research. It's about gender violence, and which is another important experience of violence in Mexico, but it's more, I would say, constant across the 20th century, right? So I tried to explain how it changed over time, but basically had certain, things there that remain. And the argument at the end was, the book doesn't have a conclusions chapter. My conclusion is that gender violence, in a way, permeates all other forms of violence. That in order to understand the other forms of violence, we have to understand gender violence. So that's how I thought a reader who was not an expert could make sense of it and perhaps enjoy the book,
Yeah, we'll come back to that final chapter because I believe it's crucial to understand the narrative arc of the whole book. But I want to first emphasize the fact that this is a history book. So this is not a philosophical reflection on violence and violence in Mexico or Mexicans. It's a history book that takes context very seriously. And I think that you purposely avoided the sort of intellectual prison or corner of offering us a strict, rigid definition of what violence is. What I think you did, and I think it's a very compelling strategy, is more or less to focus on features that can be traceable over time. You, for instance, put attention to the fact that violence is material. It builds on an infrastructure that makes it possible, and this can be like the availability of weapons, for instance, or the way institutions work, for instance. But you also focus on a very interesting aspect of violence as it happened in the 20th century in Mexico, which is that violence also is a means of communication, if you will. Violence is not necessarily just a means of, or although it can be at some points, but it always communicates something to other people. The acts of violence are always something other than just an act of destruction. They want to convey something to others, and this can change depending on whether it's in a context of religious conflict. It can change whether it's in the context of organized crime or in the context of political violence, for instance. And the other thing that I think you emphasize throughout the book is that violence is not only material and communicates something else than the act of destruction, but it also comes with a justification, with an ideology or a moral sort of reason for why these acts are justifiable and legitimate. How different actors from for instance, guerrilla groups to the state apparatus in Mexico that fought the guerrillas, they both had different understandings of why violence would be necessary. So I think that instead of providing us with a definition of violence, you provided us not necessarily with a methodology, but with a framework of how to approach violence in general. So my question would be for you, and this, of course, dispels all ideas of essentialism as Mexicans being inherently violent. But at the same time, you do offer you are of the view, I think, that violence is part of social interactions. It's part of how people relate to one another. So can you comment a little bit on this more or less methodological approach, and then we can move on to discuss specific ways how you applied these to different time periods in Mexican history?
Well, thank you for the summary. I think you really identify the things that I was trying to show, right? I mean, from the methodological point of view, yes, I wanted to look at certain things that had to be there. No, one is kind of the materiality of violence. You mentioned the infrastructure, but it's from the technology to not just the technology in terms of weapons, but technology in terms of transportation, communications. All those things shape the way in which violence is used, right? When you have newspapers and social networks, the communicative aspect of violence will change, obviously, right? I mean, the way in which violence is displayed will change. So that material aspect I thought was useful. I mean, rather than defining violence in a way that was that would constrain the analysis, I chose to say, violence is a material act. It's a relation between two people or multiple people that involves the destruction of bodies or property, right? The most general way to define it. But that requires, obviously, to understand the materiality of it and what I would call the practices of it, how you do it, for example, if you compare the way in which violence was used in the revolution and the agrarian violence, it was different. The way you shot people was different, to put it, bluntly, right? The way you use the same guns, perhaps, change according to the conditions. I mean, in the agrarian forms of violence, you were fighting against people who were your neighbors in a way. The hacienda or the ejido, they knew each other. In the revolutionary form of violence, there was an anonymity. These battles were different. So the way people approached the act of violence was very different. And also, like you said, these practices were connected to the way in which violence was legitimized, right? you had to do it a certain way, so the audience, so to speak, the people who witness or heard about what happened, they will say, yes, I mean, this makes sense. This is not arbitrary. This is something that we can understand, right? I mean, so in the case of of religious violence, against school teachers, right? What now we can see as one of the horrific aspects of the Cristiada, no? The lynchings and attacks against female school teachers was something that had to be done in a way that the audience would understand why it was being done, because these women are, corrupting our children, whatever. But the meaning of the violence is inherent, or is connected inherently with the practices of violence. So I wanted to see how that worked differently in each situation, the other thing that I would add to what you said, I think you covered basically the main points, is the insight that while violence is not irrational, it at the same time, violence is always unpredictable in its effects. In other words, you can say, the Mexican government, shot a bunch of students on October the 2nd, 1968, because they wanted to stop that student movement and have the Olympic Games in Mexico City and so forth, right? So there was an apparent ration. But what the Mexican government, President Díaz Ordaz and the regime, if you want, couldn't know, even if they thought they knew, they couldn't know what was going to happen with it. What were going to be the long-term consequences of that act of violence? Nobody can, because violence, in a way, is contingent and is disrupts, the way in which, politics operates, right? And institutions. So that, I think, was also something that I wanted to emphasize, because I didn't want to to repeat some of the explanations of violence that I heard in especially in the social and cultural history of previous decades, where, violence is a result of the state, or violence is a result of class struggle. That is something that is logical about. No, in each case, there's something that can be explained and justified and legitimized, but there's a very big component of it that is, unpredictable and disruptive in violence, right? So that was, in other words, I wanted to have the chapters in a way open-ended,
Mm-hmm.
We cannot know what's the result of even agrarian violence, I mean, it's happened a few decades ago, but we cannot say, well, this is the summary,
Thank you for that, Pablo. And once again, we'll come back to that last chapter that actually contradicts a little bit the idea of the long-term unpredictable consequences of violence. But we'll put a pin on that. First, I want to discuss with you. It's like, how do you trace violence in the archive? How does the archive show you violence? Because part of the issue with dealing with this problem is that sometimes they are not. There is no explicit record of how people who conducted violent acts perpetuated these in the archive. So how did you manage to trace violence in the archive?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, we can talk about the archive as the conventional archive, where you go and look at the documents that the state institutions or private, people produce, right? I mean, which is a typical place where one goes as a historian. And I did some of that, especially for my previous books, mainly through judicial archives. They were very important to understand how the practices of violence, because in a judicial case, you have the testimony of the victim, or the suspect, the witnesses. Their testimonies will contradict, will differ, but you can use it to understand what happened and the justifications for it. And there's some basic layer of truth there that one can extract, I believe that, about the practices of violence. But the judicial archives are limited. You cannot access them for the most of the 20th century, certainly for the second half. And you have to use other types of archive. And then what I did was to think about the archive as a broader thing. In other words, it could be judicial archives. I use them when possible, but it could also be political archives. When you have spy reports, are very interesting because they talk about not just the opposition to the regime, but also what to do with it. But also the archive in a broader sense as fiction. In other words, fiction one tends to think is a lie, right? It's a way to tell lies for entertainment, for literary purposes. But it's always a lie that tells the truth, right? So I had to be able, I had no choice but to read novels and watch movies and try to see how they talked about violence. Again, assuming that there is an element of truth behind that fiction, in the images, in the experiences, in the expected, in the reception of the readers or the viewers, no? So I used that too, and I think it was helpful. And for the more recent period, when we talk about violence, we have to talk about testimony, and the people who suffer the violence. And who speak up, and the institutions and languages of human rights were very important to change that archive, in the late 20th century. But also the changing attitudes of victims of violence. I think that's something that has transformed not only Mexico, but many countries, right? The idea that you suffer violence, but there's a measure of justice in just being able to share your experience and say what happened, right? Not justice in the legal way, but justice in the sense of restoring some of the dignity and the order that was violated by violence. So different periods require different, ideas of what the archive was, right? Journalism is the other, as I mentioned, if you want to understand, drug violence since the 1980s in Mexico, you have to start there, reading the newspapers and the magazines and some books that are excellent. They have their biases, but they're also good sources. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much. And on that note, you are a historian of crime and public opinion in Mexico. You have books on the 19th century and the idea of honor and how that played out in the public sphere. And then you are, of course, an expert on working in judicial archives because you have a couple of books that specifically focus on crime in urban settings. But you are also I would add that you also take not only journalists and in general films, novels, literature to provide an analysis of violence in different time periods, but you also pay a lot of attention to the sensationalist press, the alarma, de la prensa, all yeah, the nota roja, essentially, these newspapers and periodicals and publications that are often frowned upon because they tend to be to focus on the gruesome aspects of violence instead of providing an actual analysis of things. But I think that can you comment on how you used these otherwise very difficult and sort of opportunistic press to put that in the right context to offer us a larger picture of who was actually the target of violence in Mexico, particularly in the 20th century?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the Nota Roja, I worked on it in my previous books, and everything that you say is right. I mean, it's sensationalistic, it's gruesome, it caters to the worst instincts of readers, right? But I always thought that it was also a source for historians, but that we had to learn how to read it, basically. For many years, the people who wrote about the Nota Roja, like Carlos Monsiváis and Octavio Paz and all, they said, this is a kind of a unconscious, excrement, of Mexican culture. This is something horrible that people buy for pornographic reasons. They diminish the journalistic value of Nota Roja. No? So what I tried to do was to imagine how Nota Roja worked in an everyday life, right? And the first thing that you can find is that Nota Roja first was the genre of journalism that most people read in Mexico. It was the most successful form of journalism. The newspapers, the Nota Roja newspapers, sold more than any other kind of newspaper. And this couldn't be just because they were gruesome and pornographic. If you read them carefully, you see that photograph and narratives, they have to convey certain useful information to the reader. It's not just the drama, but it's where the drama happened, what weapons were used, what happened to the victim. Did the victim, contribute to what happened? All those things are useful information that the readers, when they bought the Alarma, La Prensa, all those newspapers, they were looking for that, because they had to navigate a city that, was dangerous. So there's some degree of truth there that we have to learn how to read without, making any, intellectual assumptions about the literary quality. It's what it is, right? I mean, by the way, some very good writers, worked in the Nota Roja, like José Revueltas, and they wrote Nota Roja copy, and some very good photographers came out of the Nota Roja, no, like Enrique Metinides, no. So it wasn't all low quality, right? So Nota Roja to me was very important, and I think it helped me, understanding its biases. It helped me understand the criminal. The one important bias that you already mentioned is that they had to sell, so they had to present the story in a way that people would buy the newspaper. That's, if you understand that logic, that helps you understand the narratives and the way in which the information is presented. Like any source, they will have biases. You have to understand them.
Sure. And they, like you said, they were also catering to an audience, and they were very conscious about the public opinion, how public opinion would debate these contents. Yeah. You kind of do that throughout the book as well. You not only pay attention to the acts of violence, but how they play out in the public opinion. Being a historian of the press and the public opinion in Mexico, you paid attention to that as well.
Yeah. Yes.
So let me move on and then try to discuss some of the things that you analyze in each of these chapters. Let me frame this by saying that the book focuses on the 20th century, the 21st century. I think that you made that choice because you were asked to essentially write a brief history of violence in Mexico, so that you could only do that many chapters. So you made a choice of focusing specifically on the 20th century, perhaps because of your expertise. But anyways, the point is that you start the book in the revolution, and what we can learn about violence in the revolution, being in the revolution a very violent period in general. What did you learn by going through the historiography the vast historiography of the revolution about violence in that specific period.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge historiography on the revolution, and it's mostly focused on the kind of the military aspects of it, the political aspects of it, and also the social causes of the revolution, right? Those have been the main questions, that why would people pick up the rifle and fight? Obviously, the land, justice, elections, all those things have been very important for the historiography, and the historiography is very rich also in its regional diversity. This was something that worked differently in different places. So that was one finding. In other words, the reason why one would decide to take, an old rifle and join other people and attack the federal garrison or attack the police station or go to the hills, and rebel. Those reasons were very different in different regions. Morelos is a prototype of agrarian prompted violence of communities that were dispossessed by haciendas. But if you look at the Huasteca or other regions, it was different, because it was ranchero communities that had a different logic, right? Where for them justice was more important, or cacique rule was more of a problem, right? So that was one finding. The other finding that to me was important was the way in which the violence of the revolution was very destructive, not just in terms of the enhanced capacity of weapons. They began to use machine guns and other things, that were not there in the 19th century, but also in the way in which it impacted the civilian population. So I saw how, it wasn't just about, the armies fighting each other, but it was about the displacement of people. They had people who had to run away from the communities, refugees into the cities, disease, that, killed a lot of people during the revolution. Even, the lack of, subsistence in some cases. That was a problem in Mexico City and other regions. There was no food. So these are all effects of violence that in some cases are deliberate. You want to create that, situation for the civilians, because it will impact the adversaries. This was very clear in the case of Morelos, when the federal army was fighting Zapata. Was, attack the civilian population so you can undermine your right. One thing that came to be very evident, and that the historiography has largely neglected until now, is the role of sexual violence in the revolution. That's something that we all know that sexual violence is part of war in all situations. But I was surprised both by the how pervasive it was. Everyone was doing it, right? But also how it has been silenced by the histories and the memory of the revolution. I mean, the work of Helga Bateman is very good, and other people who are working on that are really bringing out this dimension of the revolutionary violence that I think is very important, because not only the social cost of it, but also because it is something that stayed with us, in part because we didn't want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing that I learned from this. Yeah.
Thank you, Pablo. And then when you focus on the 20s, 30s, and a little bit of the 40s as post-revolutionary period takes hold, you make some very insightful, I believe, references and comparisons to the US. There's a couple of places where you discuss lynchings, for instance, in the US and Mexico, and then how you compare criminal organizations in the US in the 20s and 30s compared to drug trafficking in the same period in Mexico. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to do that and the contents of that?
Well, to be honest, the first thing that led me into this, question was the way in which Mexican pistoleros dressed. They just look like gangsters, like movie gangsters. Maybe that was the fashion of the times, but the more I looked into it, it became very clear that it was also an exchange, right? I mean, or at least a perception that there is this, modern aspect of crime that they were emphasizing. They were modern people who were using machine guns and impunity to profit. They were very rational economic actors, if you want to put it but obviously using violence, right? So the movies, I think, I wouldn't say that Mexican gangsters were just imitating US movies. There were also Mexican movies that were very interesting in their way, in the way they absorbed and reuse that, visually, but also in terms of stories about these sinister characters, right? And also some narrative fiction. So there's this cultural commonality that I think it was very important, without saying that it was influence, because I thought that when you say that, you tend to remove agency from your subject, right? I mean, they were using what they had. They were using the same machine guns that Al Capone was using, the Thompson, because they were like horrible things that shot high caliber bullets very fast. No, so that was something that was incorporated. But the thing that I thought was interesting or made the comparison useful was to try to understand the impact of the impunity of Mexican pistoleros, as opposed to the way in which the mob, the mafia, and in the US operated. They also had the complicity of the police, but it worked in a different way. So we really had to understand how it worked in Mexico, how the politics in a way involved access to that kind of illegal means of of gaining through the use of pistoleros. So I thought it was, I mean, I'm not saying obviously that the US was perfectly clean in that sense. In fact, they wanted to ignore the problem. The problem was there, but it worked differently politically, I think. So that comparison, I think, highlighted the particularities of the Mexican case.
Sure. And there is also this idea that organized crime in Mexico has always been organized and part of the comparison that you made me think that, and then I think that you actually argue in some of the chapters that the idea of mafia came from the United States. The Mexican press starts to use that language to refer to criminals in general. But the level of organization in the 30s and 40s was actually more prominent in the United States. It was more violent in that sense in the United States than Mexico. So this idea of the organized crimes always been in charge and dominating the public sphere in Mexico, sort of is dispelled by emphasizing the fact that the United States in the 30s and 40s, 20s really, in the 20s and 30s was actually had a lot more organized crime than Mexico. That I took from these chapters.
Absolutely.
And moving on, can you discuss a little bit on this idea as Mexico changes? The book also makes a very good job in in tracing violence in different time periods as Mexican society changes. So you focus on the 40s, and then you explain how Mexican society becomes more urban, therefore other forms of manifestations of violence appeared because now they have a different setting. So one of the things that I noticed and I thought was really interesting is this idea of the criminal literacy, that everyone in Mexico in the 40s and 50s knew how to behave, to conduct themselves vis-a-vis police officers, military, politicians, in order to avoid the violence that came with pistoleros, politicians, military. So can you explain a little bit the notion of criminal literacy as it operated in Mexico in the 40s and 50s?
Yes. I mean, that's something that I, first, used in the History of Infamy book, the one that before that. And basically, the idea is that starting from the Nota Roja, no, but also other cultural products, I came to believe that the stories and explanations of crime that were not scientific or legal or the elite explanations, but the everyday life stories and explanations of what happened in the corner, in the bar, etc. The way people thought about crime had a very, I would say, deep rationality and coherence, in the sense that they were, as I said, useful knowledge. If you know how a police will, extort money from you, you will learn how to avoid the situations in which, you become a victim of the police. If you're arrested, many people in Mexico, and this is something that still operates today, you know that a bribe early on is much better than a bribe later on. If you pay the cop in the corner, you will pay less than if you have to pay in the offices of the Ministerio Público, and much less than you will have to pay a judge, right? You know that, right? I mean, so it's common sense, but it's something that is also learned, right? I mean, it's also that comes from experience. It's not it's not obvious. So I thought that in a way, the kind of the scholarship had kind of neglected that kind of knowledge and the way in which that knowledge circulated, through Nota Roja, stories, comic books, So I thought it was worth, highlighting how it was something that it was intellectually sound, in other words, even if it wasn't prestigious, right? It was not criminology, was not criminal law, but it worked, and I think that it still works, in the sense that on everyday experience in Mexico, to greater or lesser degree, depending where you live and other factors, you need to have certain awareness and experience, and you have to talk to people, and you have to understand what happened. A lot of that happens now in Facebook, but I think it's still useful information, and it's not completely pornographic, in other words.
Sure. Thank you, Pablo. We already have a couple of questions, so I'll ask one more question and then a question myself, and then read the questions from the public. So my last question would be related to this idea of the experts of violence that you trace, the pistoleros, the hitman, the actors that were associated with violent acts that came out of this massive transformation of Mexico in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Then they became associated with the rise of proper criminal organizations in Mexico in the 90s and 80s. So can you talk a little bit about this idea of the experts of violence and how they became part of what we now associate with violence in Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, I would say since the 1930s and even 20s, according to some people who done histories of agrarian, so there were these in the ejidos, in the communities, there were people who were more skillful, right? And more effective in the use of violence. And they capitalized on that, right? They knew how to use guns, but they also knew how to, in the case of agrarian violence, how to commit a homicide and then get away with it, right? Frame it in a way which it was a fight between drunks, and so it wasn't an assassination, right? I mean, all those things is not just having access to guns, but make some people more effective, and they use that, right? So that's something that is there. We can see in the emergence of caciques, since the 1930s, and 20s in some places. But it's not limited to that. In other words, I mean, I wouldn't trace a genealogy, from the agrarian caciques to the narcos, right? I mean, a lot of things happen in between. One of the things that happened, I mean, I would mention three episodes, right? I mean, one is that many of these experts of violence became, bodyguards or agents of the police, or, one anecdote that people, I've heard several people is when Miguel Alemán came to Mexico City after being governor of Veracruz to work in the cabinet as secretary, he brought a bunch of pistoleros from Veracruz, and he created the Dirección Federal de Seguridad. So the Dirección Federal de Seguridad was supposed to be the FBI, but in fact, it was a bunch of guys who, were doing things their way, in Veracruz, and then, moved. It's not the only cause of that, as I said, but it's a very meaningful, anecdote, I think. In other words, these guys were institutionalized in a way. They had badges now. They have the charolas, which allow them to avoid arrest, basically. So that's, one important episode. These guys were able to use violence in a way that was very targeted, very effective against political opposition, against, and so we can say, that certainly there's less violence in general in the mid-20th century, but that doesn't mean that there isn't that kind of, political violence. There's plenty of it. Then the other moment is when the drug business becomes very profitable because of the increasing demand from the US since the 1960s, although there was a market even before that. So there's a lot of money there. And some of these experts of violence who are, in the judicial police, the local police, the army, they want in. Basically, they're supposed to, interdict, arrest, and prevent drug trafficking. That's what the US wants Mexico to do. But it is very clear. Some people make an argument that I think is very persuasive. Ben Smith, for example, the real violence of the drug traffic business started when the police get sick, and they begin to steal from drug traffickers, to extort and torture drug traffickers, right? So that's an important moment in that it gives these experts of violence, an expanded economy, if you want, right? There's more money there, right? And then, what happens I would say since the 90s, although, some people could argue it's earlier, but it's clearly in the 90s, right? The drug organizations, instead of just paying the police for protection, which is what they did when the police, wanted a cut of the business, instead of doing that, they just created their own, armed forces, if you want, right? I mean, they hire them full-time, basically. So these experts of violence were now people who could use weapons and communications, many of them trained by the military, and deploy violence in ways that were more visible and destructive. So we still have that. We still have, actors in organized crime that generate most of the violence because that's what they do. And they use it to protect their business, but also to now extract resources, from extortion, from kidnapping, from human trafficking. So I would say that these experts of violence have found, even more of a function economically in the last 30 years, right? And that obviously has transformed them in many ways, right?
Thank you, Pablo. So let me then move on and read you the questions from the public. The first one, it comes from precisely Helga Beitum. So the question is, I'm a big fan of your La Violencia en Mexico book, so I am curious. In the translation, you say that readers in Mexico improved the text. In what ways, however small, did your ideas change?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because, the book is basically the same, but the way, there's a lot of decisions that you do when you explain the book, but also when you translate the book that change it, right? But I think what I meant when I said that they change the book is that when they read them, they make something else of it, right? I offer this history, but the way in which that history is used can be very different according to who's reading it. So I think that from conversations with people who read the book, I think one thing that wasn't aware before, but became aware with the Mexican readers was that this could also be very helpful to make sense of family and community memory, right? In other words, oh yes, I heard several people say, yes, I had a grandfather or a great grandfather who was a pistoler, or this in a way resonated with experience that I would be very happy if the book helps situate that memory historically. In other words, we're not talking about the shame of the family here. We're talking about part of national history. I mean, it's what was happening in the country, right? So I thought, and also the same with the question of the victims, right? I mean, in other words, I in the discussions about the last chapter on gender violence, not everyone agrees with the way in which I frame it, but I think it helps for people to understand that there's nothing natural about it, that there is a history of gender violence. That is not how, it's not the way things are. It's something that people do, and that since people do, it can be reversed. So I think that with the US translation, I maybe it's too early to say, but I would just hope that, this is useful in a tiny way to contextualize the way in which the current government is weaponizing, these ideas about Mexico as a. I mean, what I try to emphasize in the introduction for the English edition is that, this is not all of it, right? I mean, this is one aspect of life in the country that we have to try to understand. We cannot avoid it, but it's not everything. So we have to not just understand violence, but also understand why violence is not always there, right? I mean, it's not everything.
Sure.
So hopefully that will help,
And the book does that. It provides perspective and context. I won't get into details, but I was thinking about my grandfather, who was essentially the chapter on agrarian violence explained why he moved from Veracruz to Mexico City, because he was running away from apparently some experts of violence that were after him. And then in order to save his life, he moved to Mexico City. Anyways, it does.
Veracruz was crazy. Yeah.
But thank you for that response, Pablo. Then we have here Georgina Rodriguez. So I'm going to read her question. If we go back to the classical definition of the modern state as the one holding the monopoly of legitimate violence, would you say in the modern history of Mexico state, has consistently failed at constraining other kinds of illegitimate violence then? Or how would you describe it generally in light of this definition?
Yes, that's an important theoretical point, right? I mean, if a lot of the historiography and scholarship on violence, used to assume this Max Weber, definition of the state monopoly of violence, right? I think obviously, a lot of people have done work that shows that, it's not so useful, and my point was that, there was never a monopoly of the legitimate use of violence. And I think that the words that one uses are important because obviously there's no monopoly because social actors use violence, right? In ways that can be very, effective for their purposes, right? But also their violence is also legitimate. The violence that social actors engage in can have legitimacy. It's difficult to accept that. It's difficult to accept that the lynching of people could be, a legitimate use of violence, but it is if we put it in the right context, right? So I think that looking at that definition can help us, hope for a rational, institutional system, right? That would be optimal, right? But the history shows very clearly that it's never been like that. I'm not saying that it will always be like that. I believe that justice should work, but it hasn't. So, we cannot distort the way we approach the history using a definition that refers to an ideal type that is not supported by the evidence. So I don't know if that answers. Yeah.
So the book also provides elements to think about the state itself and how the violence, the monopoly of violence of the state is also very more complex than we thought. It's not only the military and the police forces, but you mentioned that sometimes the pistoleros were essentially criminals and police, members of the police. They were part of the military, but they also became part of the criminal organization. So it's a lot more complex, and the book helps us to think about that.
Yeah.
But thank you for the question and then for your answer. Moving on because the questions are piling up. So Carol Browner asks, wonderfully interesting talk. Thank you both. I'm wondering about the extent to which you consider violence in indigenous communities, both among indigenous residents and indigenous versus non-indigenous. Please talk a little bit about this. Thank you.
Yes, I mean that's something that at different times has been a very important aspect. I mean, again, we shouldn't essentialize, and we have to understand how it operated in different ways, right? I mean, for example, during the revolution, how some indigenous groups were forced to mobilize, and fight, and how in some regions, like in Oaxaca, there was this idea of indigenous or certain indigenous groups as particularly violent and effective soldiers, people you had to be afraid of, right? This idea of the barbarians, right? I mean, that was there. But also there was obviously the something that I think is implied in the question is the resistance by indigenous communities. I mean, there's very good anthropology about Oaxaca and other states where it shows how violence is part of life, and it operated as a way to maintain certain cohesion, keep external actors at bay, but also was very costly, socially, right? So I would say that's a different kind of violence from the kind of the revolutionary agrarian violence, right? The other thing that has been, since the 90s, very important in terms of indigenous, groups in Mexico and violence is the idea that there's been a history of expropriation and enslavement and displacement that it's inevitably part of the history of indigenous communities. I mean, in Chiapas is the clearest example, right? So, not saying that indigenous people in Chiapas were always passive. Obviously, they some of them, rebelled, but that this is something inherent to the relation of indigenous communities with the rest of the economy, the rest of the state, right? So what I would say is that, it's always there. It appears in different ways, and we shouldn't think that there's one key to that relation. Indigenous groups are very diverse in different contexts, and there's nothing essentially good or bad about them. They're just like a group of in Mexican society. So we have to understand them in that multidimensional way, I think.
Sure. Thank you, Pablo. And thank you, Carol, for the question. Peter Reich asks, thank you for a very illuminating presentation. How do you view the relationship between violence and government structure? What role has state and local autonomy played, and how has this factor changed over time?
Well, that's kind of the whole book. Yeah, I mean, basically, one of the arguments is that if we just focus on the state as the source of violence, or this actor that seeks to monopolize violence, we won't understand a lot of things. We have to really understand state institutions in constant negotiation and tension with social actors across the history of Mexico during the 20th century. In other words, the way you negotiated with the ejidos, the way you negotiate with urban communities, violence is there. The state doesn't control all of it. It doesn't want to, and also the state itself, as you mentioned earlier, is not a monolith. It's very interesting to see how different parts of the state, different agencies are often fighting each other, or at least not collaborating as they should, right? That's something that we really have to appreciate. When we say the police, are we talking about the judiciary, the state police, the local police, the many different police agencies that emerged throughout the 20th century? They're not one thing. They have different interests, and they sometimes operate at odds with each other, sometimes violently so.
Sure. And there is in the chapter that discusses guerrilla groups, and then the cruelty of the military and police response against these guerrilla groups. You also mentioned that in part you discuss how guerrilla members understood the state. And part of what you analyze there is that some of them had this idea of the state as being very monolithic, which complicated things for their cause. But anyways, again, this is a very rich book that people should read carefully. Carol Browner has a second question. I'm going to skip it for the time being because I want to finish the conversation with that particularly. But David Garcia wonders about how US films like Man on Fire or shows like Narcos have a negative impact on how Mexico is viewed by US and Mexican audiences.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, if you look at movies and fiction in the US and the way they depict Mexico throughout the 20th century, you can certainly say, there are movies like Man on Fire, like Sicario, a bunch of movies that really, reinforce these stereotypes about Mexicans, as violent, corrupt, treacherous, passive against violence. There's that. I wouldn't, but I would argue after living, many years in the US, there's another dimension to that cultural conception of Mexico in popular culture, which is Mexico as the place of freedom and escape. You can see that in many movies and many, I mean, this is the place you go to be yourself. You know, the beatniks did that, you know, Kerouac, Ginsberg, you know, Cassidy, they fled to Mexico because they could do what they could do what they wanted to do, which is basically get high. But, you know, Mexico was an ideal place, and you can even see that in film noir before in the 30s. The emergence of Acapulco, Puerto Vallarta, the Night of the Iguana. You know, there's a very strong, you know, aspect of that. Those depictions of Mexico that associate the country as this place where you can escape. You can be free from whatever is chasing you in the U.S. You know, the latest, you know, one where you see that is One Battle After Another. There's a very small, you know, element of that I was, you know, trying to pay attention to, but that's it, right? I mean, one character who did, you know, certain violent things, she disappears into Mexico, right? We never hear from her again, you know. No, well, you know.
Spoiler alert.
Exactly, spoiler alert. I'm sorry to all of you, but basically that's what it is, right? I mean, there's this element of Mexico as this place that is not completely dangerous and horrible, but it's a place of potential freedom from the constraints of the U.S.
Thank you, Pablo. So the last three questions are all connected, and they are, of course, focused on the idea of how gender informs your research, specifically for this book, and also the last chapter. So I'm just going to read the three questions, and then perhaps we can wrap things up with your answer. So Carol Browner asks, given its importance, how come gender violence ended up at the end of the book? Then Meisu Louis wonders about, you said that we must understand gender violence to understand other forms of violence. Can you elaborate? And then Vivian Hernandez asks, I found the last chapter on gender violence incredibly fascinating and timely. I'm curious if you could chat a little bit about the scholars who helped shape your argument around the prevalence of gender violence throughout the 20th century and up until the current moment. Also, do you have any advice for grad students working on historicizing different types of gender violence in Mexico within the last 50 years? So they all come down to this big question of gender and violence, how it's connected to violence in Mexico in the 20th century.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I mean, let me see if I can cover them all. I mean, the reason why I put that chapter at the end is methodological in a way, because the information that we have about gender violence during most of the 20th century is, I would say, very flat, in the sense that the statistics don't tell us much about it, because obviously people didn't press charges, you know, because if you were a victim of sexual violence, you didn't want to go to the police, right? I mean, so that's, it's a hidden there, right? So it's difficult to look at it historically as it changes over time, you know. There are some elements, as I mentioned, of that are very important of sexual violence, the revolution, agrarian, and religious violence. There's certainly an evolution of the use of violence to control prostitution in the mid-20th century. But I didn't think that should be in the middle of the book or at the beginning of. I put it at the end because what has happened in the last few years is that our views or attitudes about gender violence have changed, because I would say the most important social movement against violence in Mexico is not the middle class demonstrations against kidnapping, is the mobilization of women, trans people, you know, everyone who is in different ways a victim of sexual. That has really opened our eyes in a way that we couldn't, during most of the 20th century. In the 70s and early, some feminist organizations began to complain or work around the question of, sexual and domestic violence. But it's only in recent years that it's out there, and it's a problem that nobody can avoid, and policies and laws are changing. So our perspective on that historical process has changed. So I try to understand and benefit from that social mobilization to see something that wasn't there, but we were not looking at. So for me, it's been very important to, first of all, read some people who work about gender violence, mainly Rita Segato, an anthropologist who worked on Brazil. Well, it's very famous, right? I mean, don't have to explain, but basically she a couple of things that she proposes are, I think, very important. One is that sexual violence is not about sex. Sexual violence is a form of communication. It's a form of enacting domination. And it's public. It has to be shared with an audience. That's an important point, but because I think it connects, or it helps me understand the other forms of violence. They always have an audience. They always have, it's not just about, shooting somebody to get the money. It's shooting somebody because they don't do what you want. I mean, there's an extra to violence, and there's always an extra to sexual violence that is meaningful. So I think that, that insight has been very useful to understand violence in general to me. And, there's been, wonderful work on, on women and crime in the 20th century. Marta Santillán is one I would mention, but there's many more scholars that I would, I'm sorry if I don't mention. Helga's doing great work, We have to look at how that worked in the context, who benefited, how we operated, why it was justified. In the case of Santillán, I mean, she really explains how the logic of prostitution changed, right? As an economy, but also as the use of violence when women were not protected in brothels, but by pimps, in the corners, in the streets. So the role of violence there is very important, and I think that, and then there's a lot of, work by organizations, public health, scholars about the cost and the experience of domestic violence, right? I think that's something that we have to begin to look at historically, or how that, is something that is not nature. It's operated, justified, enacted in different ways across history, and we have to understand not only how it works, but also how people reject it. And that, I think, is what has changed, in the last, decades in Mexico and in many other countries too. Yeah.
Thank you, Pablo. So let me just add that the book does not just skips the gender aspect and puts it in the end of the book. Each chapter discusses a little bit of how gender violence operated and played out in different time periods. But the general scope of the book made it really difficult to just focus on one or two aspects in each time period. So I believe that for readers, it does, just to clarify that for readers, each chapter does focus a little bit on gender, but then the last chapter focuses entirely on gender and violence. The second, for readers also who are interested here, because this is a brief history of violence in Mexico, and it's part of in its original form of the Historia Minimas. It does not really have a lot of footnotes, or it doesn't have footnotes, but it does come with a sort of bibliographic appendix where people can see the scholars upon you based your analysis for this book, including the chapter on gender. But I would say that all of the chapters the bibliography that you use for each chapter is included in a way in that last appendix. So for readers, it's very useful for graduate students, and I would say also for undergrads, and anyone who is interested in the topic and history would benefit from that.
I'm sorry, I forgot the part of the question about, what advice, I don't know. It's difficult. I mean, but I think that there's a lot that still needs to be done, about the history of gender violence. And a lot of it is in the archives. It's waiting for us to read it in a good way, I think that the revolution and the first half of the 20th century it's really, a period in which we have to bring new eyes into the evidence, yeah.
And the book more generally, again, that the purpose is to provide a general summary of what we know. And you made some choices, but provide some framework to focus on different sorts of violence that are not necessarily as evident, but we know for sure that are also connected to what you discussed in the book, like different sorts of violence that are part of everyday life and that are very hard to trace in the archive, but the archive will eventually, if you ask the right questions, tell you that story too. So you open the book, and with this I end. You open the book saying that, according to Hannah Arendt, the long-term effects of violence are not necessarily predictable, or we cannot know the long-term effects of violence, and because we don't know the future. But at the same time, the book concludes in this chapter on gender that based on Rita Segato, there is one thing that we can predict, which is that all sorts of violence in the end are not only gender violence, but that violence in general reinforces patriarchy. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and maybe wrap things up?
Yeah. Yes, that's an aspect of Rita Segato's analysis that is very important, right? I mean, the centrality of patriarchy and the way in which patriarchy is associated with all other forms of power and domination, right? I mean, it's kind of essential to even, international relations in her view, right? I don't think I go that far, but I think it's important to understand what she and other people mean by patriarchy. It's something that, we cannot just ignore. It's an important concept that is used, and we have to be able to engage with it, right? I mean, as I was saying, my view, and this is just a speculation, right? I mean, if we're talking about the future, so I can say anything, right? The changes in attitudes in the last years in Mexico, and we can also arguably say the changes in access to education, urban, services, and are changing the way in which people interact in terms of gender difference, right? I'm not saying just the relation between men and women, but the way in which difference is conceptualized and accepted. There's something changing there. And I think that if Hannah Arendt also said, humans, you cannot, predict the future because humans are about, generating life, right? I mean, what a human being does that is different from anything else is it will produce something that will have no control over, and it will continue to make history and be life, right? So we cannot say what will happen, but I think my view is that there is something that is changing, and we have to be attentive to that and not fall into, the idea that since we cannot predict what will happen to violence, we will always have it, right? Who knows, it might be that these social attitudes toward violence will have eventually, through many I mean, this is not something I will change quickly, an impact on the levels and frequency of violence in Mexico.